Hello and welcome to the nervous system part 3. In this video, we will be discussing the brain's overview, the left and right sides of the brain, and the four lobes of the brain. So first, we're going to be discussing the brain, and this will be an overview. So it's important to recognize that the brain is the main organ that controls the entire nervous system. All nervous system functions lie in the brain. And because of that, the brain processes messages that are sent by the body. And it's important to realize that the body attains these messages through basically observing the outside environment. And the brain also controls the main mental processes, such as thinking, expressing emotion, reasoning, and memory. And as we discussed in the later videos, it regulates involuntary functions. And involuntary means an action that we do not have control over. And some of these are blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, and temperature. So it's important to realize that the brain regulates these processes that aren't necessarily a physical aspect like memory or thinking. Like there is no physical aspect to that, but it also regulates physical things such as blood pressure, heart rate. These are all physical quantities. So the brain is a pretty amazing organ if you think about that. Next, we're going to be discussing the left side of the brain. And so the left side of the brain controls movement on the right side of the body. It's important to realize that whichever aspect or whichever part of the brain you're talking about, it always controls movement on the opposite side of the body. So left controls movement on the right, right controls movement on the left. So if something were to happen, such as a stroke that caused damage to the left side of the brain, you would basically be paralyzed on the right side of the body in most cases. So, next, the left side of the brain controls logical reasoning, and also it controls scientific and mathematical thinking and skills. It's important to realize that if you are bilingual or speak multiple languages, this would mean that your left hemisphere, which is also another word for side, your left hemisphere side is very developed. This is why it's really important and very beneficial if you know multiple languages. And it's important to know that the left side of the brain also analyzes the environment and everything like that. So next we're going to be going over the right side of the brain. And like I said earlier, whichever side you're talking about, movement on the opposite side is controlled. So the right side controls movement on the left side of the body. Notice that it says just movement. It will only control movement, not any other abstract quantity such as memory, just movement. So the right side of the brain controls things like emotional awareness this time and musical and artistic skills. So if you're somebody that plays an instrument or is good at painting and drawing, these things mean your right side of the brain is getting a lot of practice, which basically will help to stimulate the production of neurons and basically making you smarter. Next, the right side of the brain controls creativity and imagination, and it helps in recognizing facial signs and attributions, which is why it's important. So, it's important to read facial language in order to understand what a person is trying to convey to you or their inner thoughts. So, which is why both hemispheres of the brain and just the brain in general is a very important organ. Next, we're going to be talking about the various lobes in the brain. So first we have the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So the frontal lobe is basically located near the front of your brain, basically your forehead area. And it's the center of your personality, and it helps in controlling impulsivity. So a person who isn't very impulsive or is very impulsive, that all has to do with their frontal lobe. And it's important to note that the frontal lobe basically controls things like speech, problem solving, emotions, and just reasoning in general. So the frontal lobe is basically the center of your personality and who you are as a person. Next, we have the parietal, which is located on the top of the brain. So, this lobe is basically responsible for any sensory changes that the body may detect, sending signals to the brain. These are things like pain, the application of pressure on your body, touch, and temperature. Next, we're going to be discussing the temporal lobe and occipital lobe. So, the temporal lobe is basically located on the side of the brain, and it's responsible for things like hearing and smell. And even though it controls these things, it also controls more of a fact based and visual memory. And also, it interprets language. So, many hemispheres of the brain and parts of the brain can control a variety of things, and there is a lot of intermixing between the functions of each part. And lastly, we have the occipital lobe, which is basically the one with the easiest function. It's located at the back of the brain and is responsible for controlling vision. So, if somebody was to say getting in an accident caused that applied a lot of pressure to the back of their head, this would cause them to necessarily black out. If somebody falls and hits their head so it hits the back of their head on something, that's why it causes them to lose their vision, because the occipital lobe is responsible for controlling vision. Okay, question time. Which lobe of the brain would determine how impulsive a person is? I'll give you 5 seconds to answer. Okay, if you said B, frontal lobe, you are correct. So A is occipital lobe. As we mentioned earlier, the occipital lobe controls vision, which does not have anything to do with impulsivity. Then we have the parietal lobe, which is responsible for sensory changes such as pain, pressure, touch, and temperature. So again, not impulsivity. Then we have the temporal lobe, which is located on the side and has something to do with hearing and smell. Again, not impulsivity. The frontal lobe basically determines how impulsive a person is and is the center of their personality. Okay, question 2. Which of the following aspects does the left side of the brain control? I'll give you 5 seconds to answer. If you said C, mathematical applications, you are correct. So, as we mentioned earlier, the left side of the brain controls scientific and mathematical applications and reasoning. Imagination, creativity, and facial recognition have everything to do with the right side of the brain. Next, we have which lobe of the brain would be impaired in a person who is blind? Again, I'll give you 5 seconds to answer. If you said occipital lobe, you are correct. So, as we mentioned earlier, occipital lobe controls vision. So, if somebody is blind, that means their vision is impaired, so the occipital lobe will be affected. The frontal lobe again controls your personality, which does not have anything to do with blindness or um, absence of vision. Then we have temporal lobe, which is located at the side, again controls hearing and smell, nothing to do with blindness. And parietal, again, controls sensory stuff, or sensory stimuli, and which is pressure, temperature, things like that. Again, nothing to do with blindness. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.